thalamus is this one right here. Okay? Thalamus. Information center, meaning it acts like, okay, all of the information come into your brain, okay? Now, that information has to be sorted. Certain part of the brain deals with this, certain part of the brain deals with that, but everything just comes there. And the thalamus is responsible to differentiate it. Well, okay, vision, you need to go here. Hearing, you need to go here. Sensory, you need to go here. Does that make sense? Okay? It's like you're sending, you want to send a mail. Okay, everything goes into the post office. Doesn't the post office take all the mail and go into the major post office, and then they sort it out? This is for East Coast, this is for Midwest. Same thing. Okay? Now, pineal gland, which is right here, okay, which is called epithalamus. Because it's technically kind of, this photo is bad to see, but when you actually look at the brain in your lab, you will see it's actually kind of located on top of the thalamus. So epi means above. Okay, so you have the thalamus on top right here, top to the side, you have epithalamus. Below it, you have hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is responsible for homeostasis. It has a lot of functions. So right now I'm just going to collectively say it's responsible for homeostasis of the body. Okay? So you have three structures. Here's the hypothalamus. Thalamus, above it is supposed to be epithalamus, below it hypothalamus. Okay? Collectively, the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus is called diencephalon. So those are the structures that make up, I mean there are more, and probably in the lab you will see more. I'm just going to keep it to this much. Forebrain, cerebrum, diencephalon, and corpus callosum. Diencephalon, three different structures, thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. Okay? Now, midbrain stays as midbrain, which is right here. This is the midbrain right here. Midbrain relays visual and auditory inputs. It coordinates movement as well. Okay? Then you have the hindbrain. Hindbrain further got divided into three different structures. This is the pons. Okay? Pons is this protrusion right here. Close to this. It's better to see when you're actually looking at the brain. Pons. It connects the cerebellum, spinal cord, and cerebrum together. So it connects the spinal cord and the big brain and the small brain, all three of them together. Okay? Pons also help the medulla do its function. Okay? Medulla is basically right here. Medulla is responsible for, it's called medulla oblongata. Oblongata. Medulla oblongata. O-B-L-E-N-G-A-T-A. Medulla oblongata. Everybody just says medulla. Medulla oblongata basically is responsible for autonomic functions in internal organs, meaning that it allows you to breathe, stuff like that. Okay? Your respiratory center is in the medulla oblongata. F, so which is this right here, is cerebellum. Cerebellum, which is your small brain. Bell is small. Okay, cerebellum. Cerebrum, big brain. Cerebrum, big brain. Cerebellum, small brain. Okay? Yes?
What did you say the medulla does again?
Medulla helps, it's responsible for autonomic functions, meaning your breathing and all of that sort of stuff. Now, so the hindbrain split up into three structures: pons, medulla, and the cerebellum, okay? Your forebrain is basically the cerebrum, diencephalon, and the corpus callosum, and the midbrain stays as midbrain for you guys. Okay? Now, have you ever, what is the cerebellum responsible for? Control skills and movement. It's responsible for fine skill movement. Does that mean that you learn how to walk from there? No. But, okay, as a child, when he's learning how to walk, he's all wobbly. But as he gets older, his movements become more refined, right? What happens if you, if a cop, if he thinks that before this breathalyzer came out, how did he examine if you were under the influence? He told you to close your eyes and walk in a line, right? Or told you to close your eyes and bring your finger to your nose. Because that's responsible for cerebellum. Cerebellum causes you to walk straight. If you're under the influence of alcohol, it will suppress that function. And therefore, alcoholic tends to have more wavy walk. So it's called the ataxic gait. Does that make sense? This is why they tell you just to walk in a straight line. If you are under the influence, you will not be able to. If you have not drank, you will be able to walk in a straight line. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the cerebrum. As I said, the cerebrum is made up of two hemispheres. Each hemisphere has 4 lobes. It has frontal lobe. Frontal lobe is responsible for motor activity. So any movement originates from the frontal lobe. Responsible for speech. Responsible for conscious thought. Okay? B is the parietal lobe. It's responsible for sensory information. So all of your sensory information goes to your parietal lobe. Okay? C is occipital lobe. Occipital lobe, and it's responsible for visual information. So the vision, which is still sensory, it's not going, it doesn't go to the parietal, it actually goes to the occipital lobe. Okay? And this is temporal. Temporal lobe, auditory information, it's right above your ear. Comprehends language. Okay? So temporal lobe comprehends language, where frontal lobe allows you to speak. Okay? So if a person, let's say, has a stroke and their temporal lobe is basically damaged, if you even ask them what is your name, they don't understand what you're saying to them. They'll make strange faces. Okay? But what if you are, that person has stroke of the frontal lobe? You ask them what is their name, they will understand it. They will try to say it, but instead of saying Mike, something that comes out, because they can't speak now. This is why the doctor will ask you, do you know who you are? Do you know where you are? They're trying to see. Do they understand language, or they understand it, but they can't speak it? Okay? Okay. Certain organization of the signals. You have gray matter. Gray matter, as you can see right here, doesn't this outer part, the peripheral, look more gray compared to this part? So this area is called the gray matter. Right here, the lighter portion is called the white matter. Gray matter is where you find cell bodies. Cell bodies of the neurons and dendrites. Okay, so gray matter is, it houses cell bodies and dendrites. White matter is axons running through. Okay? So that's the difference between gray matter and white matter. White matter is all axons, gray matter are cell bodies, and dendrites are attached to cell bodies. Okay? Now, when we're talking about the central nervous system, you call it gray matter and white matter. White matter has a different name. In the central nervous system, white matter is called tracts or columns. Okay? Ascending tract, descending tract. They're actually axons running through because axons are long, right? Where when you talk about gray matter in the central nervous system, it's just called gray matter. When I'm talking about brain. When I'm talking about white matter in the peripheral nervous system, they're called spinal or cranial nerves. Okay, spinal or cranial nerves. So all of your nerves in the peripheral nervous system are white matter. Now, ganglions. When I'm talking about cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, okay, whenever you find cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, they're in a specific area and there's aggregation of cell bodies. And therefore, that area is called a ganglion. Does that make sense? Because in the central nervous system, it's everywhere. But in peripheral nervous system is so huge. Do you have cell bodies everywhere? No. If you have cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, they're in one specific area and they're aggregated, and that area or that aggregation is called a ganglion. It's like saying, okay, in America, we have a Chinatown, right? If I go to China, is there a Chinatown? No. But there's a Chinatown in America, right? Because what is Chinatown? Aggregations of Chinese in a particular area. Does that make sense? Yes? That's how I could explain ganglion. Okay? Because the brain is made up of neurons. That's all it's made up of in nuclear cells. But peripheral nervous system is made up of multiple substances, right? It has so much stuff besides neurons. So anytime you find cell bodies or neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, it's in a location called a ganglion. So gray matter in the brain, you just call it gray matter, but gray matter in the peripheral nervous system, you call it ganglions. White matter is made up of axons. In the central nervous system, you tend to say tracts and columns. In the peripheral nervous system, you tend to call it spinal or cranial nerves. Make sense? Other organization units. Now, the brain, this is what the brain is like. It's like cauliflower. Don't you see the space areas? Don't you see little spaces right here? Right? And then you see actually tissue. The tissue is called a gyrus. Okay, and then you see sulcus, which is the space. Tissue is actually a gyrus, and between the tissue you see a gap or space, that's called a sulcus. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, a main focus that you have to know about is the main focus that you have to know about you see that space? Okay? That is the central sulcus. Okay? That is the central sulcus. It's this space. Okay? That is the central sulcus. Right behind and right ahead and behind the sulcus, you have two main important gyrus. So you have a precentral gyrus and you have postcentral gyrus. So this is a postcentral gyrus. That is a precentral gyrus. Okay? Precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. Okay? Precentral gyrus is where motor activity originates. Motor activity originates from the precentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus is for sensory. So, when I burned my hand, that information went to my postcentral gyrus. For me, enabling me to let go of that thought, it originated from my precentral gyrus. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you can distinguish, you can find the pre and the postcentral gyrus after finding the center of gyrus. The first thing you do is find the center of gyrus, and then one above, front of it, one behind it. Now, we're going to talk about the cranial nerves. Oh, yes, fine. We have 12 cranial nerves that actually come directly off the brain. Yeah? Cranial nerve 1 is called olfactory. Olfactory nerve. Olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve 2 called optic nerve. Cranial nerve 3 called oculomotor. Oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 called trochlear. Trochlear nerve. And they're always written as Roman numerals. Okay? Cranial nerve 5 is trigeminal. Trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 6. Abducens. 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 Cranial nerve 7. Facial. Facial nerve. Cranial nerve 8. Oculomotor. Oh. Oh, vestibular cochlear. Vestibular cochlear. I was thinking of that one, but I said oculomotor. Cranial nerve 9. Glossopharyngeal. Glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve 10 is vagus. Vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 11. Accessory. Accessory nerve. Cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal. Hypoglossal. Okay? So you have olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Those are the 12 cranial nerves. They actually directly come off the brain. They come off the brain. One thing I forgot to say. When we're looking at the parts of the brain, the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. The midbrain, pons, and the medulla collectively is called the brain stem. Okay? The midbrain, pons, and the medulla collectively is called the brain stem. Midbrain, pons, and the medulla, those three structures collectively is called the brain stem. Midbrain, pons, and medulla are called the brain stem, or collectively is called the brain stem. Now, I'm not spending time with the function of each one. Find out the main function of each nerve. Okay, that's your homework. Some of them might have multiple, just the main function that nerve is known for. This is already 11:35. Okay. Spinal cord. But we still have to talk about the protection. Now, spinal cord. Spinal cord is basically, here's the spinal cord and here's the cross section of the spinal cord. Okay? Before I get into cross section, do you remember when you were looking at the skull? There was a big hole at the bottom. What was that hole called? Foramen magnum. Okay? So the medulla turns into the spinal cord. And the spinal cord exits the skull via that big hole called the foramen magnum. Okay? So if you remember in this photo, this was the cerebellum. Right here is the medulla, and the point below, the tissue below the level of the cerebellum, now it becomes the spinal cord. Okay? And the spinal cord basically exits the skull via an opening called the foramen magnum. Okay? Okay, foramen magnum. The spinal cord has different segments. The segments are named according to the vertebrae. Okay, so you have a cervical segment, then a thoracic segment, then you have the lumbar segment, sacral segment, and coccygeal segment, okay? Which becomes the tail of the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Now, your spinal cord doesn't go all the way to your lower limbs or something. It stops right there, okay, in the pelvic area. But how do you get innervation to your feet and everything? Because branches are given off. Does that make sense? Quad equina is called the tail, the ending of the spinal cord. Okay? So spinal cord exits the brain, exits the skull from the opening called the foramen magnum. It's basically collection. What is the spinal cord? Collection of gray matter and white matter, and I'll get into the details about that. It has different sections: cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, sacral region, coccygeal region, and then the ending is called the quad equina. Okay, that's the end of the spinal cord. So the cervical region is supposed to innervate the cervical part and above. Okay? Now, let's look at the cross section because you distinctly see different areas. When you look at the spinal cord, you see two distinct areas. You see the gray matter, and the gray matter looks like a butterfly. Okay? The gray matter looks like a butterfly. Right? It looks like a butterfly. Okay. Rest of it is white matter. Now, what was gray matter made up of? Gray matter was made up of cell bodies. Yes. Gray matter was made up of cell bodies. Now, the gray matter looks like butterfly. It has two horns.